It's such a pleasure to be with you all over the world. I am delighted to be part of this inaugural Pathway to 17 Summit. I'm really honored to join you, and I look forward to your questions that will follow on the initial presentation. Thank you, Nolwazi.
Thank you so much, Prof. Koker. So I'll hand over to Luyanda, who will get our presentation playing, and then we'll come back for our Q&A. So I hope you can post your questions in the chat, or in the live discussions. There's the chat or the questions options. I've got my own prepared for Prof. Koker, but obviously your questions come before mine, as always. So please feel free to pop those in as you listen through the presentation, and I hope we can have a fruitful engagement after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moderator, for this opportunity to speak about counter-proliferation financing, or CPF, and financial inclusion. In the next few minutes, I would like to outline the concept of proliferation, try and give you an idea of why this is currently so much under discussion, and then touch on the potential implications for financial inclusion. Now, starting with the concept, global rules adopted by the UN in UN conventions and captured in Security Council resolutions are aimed at restricting weapons of mass destruction. Now, a weapon of mass destruction, or WMD, refers to a broad range of weapons designed to kill, harm, or infect people, but also animals or plants through the effects of a nuclear explosion, but also through chemical warfare or biological warfare. To restrict WMDs, a lot of the rules focus on goods that can be used to build nuclear weapons or develop a chemical warfare agent or a biological warfare agent. These goods often include, and generally include, goods that can be used for good purposes, like chemicals that we can use in our houses, in our gardens, but that can also be used to construct a bomb. These goods are referred to as dual-use goods. And that's a broad category. It can include technology. It can even include data. It can include software. It can include facilities, components. As a result, the footprint of anti-proliferation is quite broad. Now, within the context of anti-proliferation, we find a range of measures aimed to neutralize the tools that are used by people who try to avoid these controls. And the tools that they use are very similar to those used by money launderers to evade money laundering controls. For instance, shell corporations. Countries involved in proliferation hide their control over entities that may buy or deal in these goods. They evade export controls by producing forged documents. The UN Security Council has taken very specific steps to neutralize specific countries that are involved in proliferation actions. And they do that through targeted sanctions against those countries, but also individuals associated with those countries. And in this regard, there's a whole raft of measures in relation to Iran. Now, that has been relaxed to some extent over the past few years, and it's politically controversial. And then North Korea is the other country that stands out. Now, the Financial Action Task Force, the global standard setting body on money laundering and terror financing, they have also extended these standards to proliferation, but specifically and only aimed at proliferation support linked to the targeted financial sanctions regime of the UN Security Council. So I've provided a broad, rough outline there of concepts for you. We should all be fairly familiar with money laundering because it's so big. It's estimated to involve between 800 billion to 2 trillion per year. So that's the big circle. We're also familiar with terror financing. That's small, and it's not in scale because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see it. I think it's much smaller than money laundering. And then you get proliferation financing, which is probably, again, smaller than terror financing or could compare with terror financing. And within proliferation financing, we have this specific area that the FATF carved out, and that is proliferation financing aimed at support or anti-proliferation financing measures aimed at supporting the targeted financial sanctions regime of the United Nations. Now, this has been in place from a FATF standards perspective since 2012. And it's been running in most institutions on a rule-based approach where names of customers and third parties are checked against the name list produced by the UN Security Council. That has not been particularly effective. So in 2020, FATF revisited these standards and then introduced a requirement to undertake a national risk assessment in relation to proliferation financing, which was not required before, but also extended that to every regulated institution. Each institution regulated for AML-CFT purposes will also be required to undertake a proliferation financing risk assessment linked to targeted financial sanctions. So that's the FATF regime. So is this relevant to developing countries? And if we think about Iran and North Korea, and you look at it from Africa, is that not just too far away to be really relevant? Well, we have UN reports on proliferation financing breaches. And just as an example, I extracted some parts relating to Africa, but there are other case studies relating to most other regions in the world. So in relation to Africa, the 2017 report listed, for example, activity in Angola, where a North Korean diplomat who was a representative of a company negotiated contracts and sold spare parts and oversaw the refurbishment of Angolan Navy patrol boats. They were front companies operating from the Seychelles and many other jurisdictions. Namibia was also lifted out, and the UN panel mentioned an example of a company associated with a listed entity that was actually involved in the construction of a munitions factory in Namibia. Uganda confirmed that North Korea was training its Air Force pilots and technicians as part of a contract that would expire in March 2018. They also had 2 police training contracts involved that would have expired in 2016. These are just examples of activity in countries where they may not have been expected. So in terms of the assessment to be undertaken, many institutions and countries have undertaken national risk assessments in relation to money laundering and terror financing, and have undertaken terror financing assessments. So how do proliferation financing assessments compare and differ? Well, in comparison, basically the same elements that you consider. You look at customer risk, you think about channel risk, geographic risk. You follow the basic same assessment methodology. You consider beneficial ownership information and checks. You want to understand the customer's business from an institutional perspective. You're looking for indicators that a customer may be hiding facts or may be using mechanisms that may hide facts. But what is different about these assessments? Well, compared to money laundering, there are far fewer cases involving proliferation financing breaches and far less expertise available nationally and globally compared to money laundering and even terror financing expertise. The assessments focus on financial matters, but also broader. For instance, the mining of certain minerals, on research and design and manufacturing of specific technologies, on trade, import, export, and shipping. And that's not knowledge that is generally available to general money laundering specialists. You also need some science and technology expertise in that assessment, especially in relation to controlled goods. Then you need a bit of geopolitical expertise, because there is this geographic focus around Iran, but mainly North Korea, and you need to understand their main trade routes, how the economies function, what the transit countries are that may be used when goods find their way to these jurisdictions when they shouldn't. And different customers may be of interest. For instance, universities may be of particular interest because of the research that they undertake. Now, against this backdrop, what are issues of concern for us from an inclusion perspective? Well, I think as I've outlined now, these risk assessments are going to be challenging and complex. And it's worrying that they'll be particularly challenging for small regulated institutions. So last year, when we first picked up on these developments, we appealed to FATF and worked together to provide recommendations on how the system could be improved, because we fully support the combating of weapons of mass destruction, but it has to be done in a manner that is sensible for developing countries. So as a result, FATF did include a low-risk institutional exemption, that if an assessment is done and a specific group of institutions are found to be low risk, that this obligation to undertake a risk assessment may not be imposed on them. But although we've asked for much more guidance, not a lot of guidance has been provided on how that exemption can be applied. We're concerned that these assessments may be rather expensive because of the expertise required. It may divert AML/CFT compliance resources, leaving small institutions a little bit more vulnerable to money laundering and terror financing while they take on board this new focus. We worry that inadequate risk assessments may actually expose smaller institutions to abuse and to supervisory enforcement and fines and penalties. We are worried that migrants and services linked to countries subject to sanctions may be viewed as higher risk, increasing costs of service delivery if services are provided to them. Larger institutions, the large banks, may be concerned about the anticipated low quality of proliferation financing risk assessments of small institutions and may consider debanking them. So these are concerns that we need to keep in mind. These obligations are not yet in force. We need national laws and regulations before these will become binding. And the drafting of those laws and regulations provide an opportunity to think about how best to do it. For example, can government lead with a national as well as an industry risk assessment? So not putting the burden on the small institutions, but actually government leading that, perhaps in a public-private partnership. How can low-risk institutions be identified effectively to ensure that they are exempted in terms of the low-risk exemption? How can remaining institutions best be supported? And would it be beneficial to undertake regional risk assessments so that the regional risk assessments can inform national risk assessments? Now, with those questions, ladies and gentlemen, I want to open the floor to questions from your side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, much for your excellent presentation, Prof. Koker. I definitely have questions from my side from your presentation. Thank you for taking us through the introduction of actually helping us understand what proliferation finance is, and then working through to see how it might affect developing countries, because it might seem like a problem for countries out there and not a problem that might actually be relevant for here or home or relevant for us, and that something we need to think about. So some of my questions, and you've already covered some of the case studies. I remember you wrote a response to FATF around the CPF measures that they were starting to roll out, and when they started writing their papers. So one question for me is, do you think FATF is open to amending the guidance due to financial inclusion considerations?
That's a very good question, Nolwazi. On the one hand, FATF has become far more sensitive to financial inclusion concerns over the years, and currently it is in the last phase of its unintended consequences project, where it's been looking at negative impact on financial inclusion, de-risking human rights and non-profit organizations. So there's a general openness to discuss issues. But I think in this case, because the standards are so new, we will first have to see implementation before the international community will be prepared to engage the matter again. Yeah. I do think that the low-risk exemption, which was not in the text that was consulted and that was inserted specifically in response to our concerns, that is a major opportunity. And it now puts the ball in the hands of everyone in our community, starting with those who are closest to country risk assessments, but also those who make policy to ensure that that space that's provided within the FATF standards are appropriately used. And only once it's appropriately used and we can demonstrate that there are further problems with the standards themselves, I think will we have good grounds to engage FATF around those changes. But for now, we need to focus on I think, appropriate and effective and efficient implementation. And perhaps one of the first things that I hope to start kind of moving some of that during this presentation, but one of the first things we need to address is that notion that this is not our concern, that we're not affected by it. If nuclear bombs explode, we will all be affected by it. Yeah. COVID is affecting all of us. Can you think what the effect would be if that was released deliberately by a state or a non-state actor? So we all share the concerns within Sustainable Development Goals that WMDs are not employed. The question is what reasonable measures are to take to prevent that. And for that, I think it's very sensible to follow a risk-based approach. Some institutions in some countries will be more exposed than others. Yes. But there isn't one country that can say we're not involved in this at all. Because if you may have some sensitive minerals, you may not have a high-tech industry, but you can be used as a transit point. Companies might be formed more easily in your jurisdiction and therefore be used as front companies to commit the fraud that's required in the trade around proliferation. So we're all in this boat together. What we need to figure out is how to do this well. And
so what I'm hearing here, Prof. Louis, is that there seems to be a capacity gap then, because that's the reason behind why some people might think this is not our problem, because they don't understand how deep it goes and where they might be vulnerable to proliferation financing, because they think it's just a surface thing of we have no influence with weapons of mass destruction, this is not our problem. So there might be a capacity gap there in understanding that, hey, we, like Zambia has copper, and they might be a target, they might be vulnerable to proliferation financing because of that.
You are quite correct. And I'm, you know, if we go back to the early days of money laundering, we had a battle to explain to banks why they need to be concerned about proceeds of crime. But still, once they started to get their mind around that, we were working with concepts that people were familiar with. As people, we understand crime.
Yes.
Terror financing in 2001, that was more difficult because not everyone understood how that worked. We're seeing that wave now with proliferation financing, and this is more complex than the other two.
Yes.
Because you need a bit of the scientific knowledge. If you don't know what to look for, what type of high-tech goods to be sensitive to, you can't do a risk assessment. And some of the stuff is quite complex. And if you're going to, I used chemicals there, but if you look at the components that can be used in different parts of nuclear bombs, some can be used in high-tech computer equipment, for example.
Exactly.
So the dual use goods, that understanding is complex. And that's why my feeling is we need to focus our capacity building on governments, and governments need to take the lead, because you can't expect every institution to upskill themselves to an appropriate level to ensure a high quality risk assessment and risk mitigation measures.
So then, is there any hope, because now regulators and financial authorities in general are jumping onto this craze around the fact that the SupTech and RegTech to help them with their AML compliance and regulatory reporting, and they most probably will rely on that for CPF, but garbage in, garbage out. So how can they harness that at the same time with trying to learn about proliferation financing and plug the two in together?
Technology is great, but technology is a tool that we can use well when we know what needs to be done. And I'm a bit concerned. I've been in a range of proliferation financing discussions and proliferation discussions as I'm trying to upskill myself too. And there are two groups of people involved. There are the scientists who've been involved in this for many years, and then now there's the AML CFT financial regulation group. Those worlds we have not bridged yet properly, and yet there are training programs being rolled out. I'm still grappling, and I'm speaking with both sides on some of the concepts, because you can't do a proper risk assessment if you don't know actually what you're assessing. And there isn't a standard definition yet of proliferation financing, for example. So it's easy to use the term, and it's easy to provide you with a little bit of a model. But if we start getting down in a risk assessment to, so where do we draw the line between PFTFS and PF? General proliferation financing, it's suddenly not that clear cut. And as a lawyer, I'm asking the questions of the scientists, and they, you know, this hasn't been part of their environment. So everyone is using terminology, but we first need to kind of unpack that and make sure that we have consistent terminology. And that's the problem with technology also. Once we have the basic concepts properly sorted out, then we'll know what type of data we need, how to use the data. Keep in mind, not all trade with North Korea is hit by sanctions. So you need a very sophisticated system to sort out what should be stopped, what should be flagged, what may go. Exactly. And for that, you need to know very clearly what the legal principles are. And despite all of the work done to date by FATF, that has actually not yet been done.
So that foundation definitely needs to be laid down before the technology can come in, because garbage in, garbage out.
Absolutely. And not only garbage, it may absolutely mislead us or put our focus on the wrong things, costing us a lot of money without preventing WMDs from proliferating.
Yeah, that's very true. So then, I mean, most of the countries, I'm thinking from the EMDE perspective, are low resourced. So how would you advise them, as we close off, because we have about 4 minutes left now? How would you advise them? They're sitting here thinking proliferation financing is not something we can ignore. But how would you advise them to start now, to not end up in a position where they're being reactive in their regulatory stance, but being proactive, but they're low resourced? How could you advise them to make sure that they're up to speed, or they gain the necessary knowledge or skills, just so that they know what's out there and how they could possibly be affected, even though they don't have enough resources per se to get bespoke training for their specific context?
That is an excellent question. I haven't really thought about that, but I am now. I'd say the starting point for a country is to do a bit of expertise mapping. So don't think because you don't know anything about it that no one in the country knows anything about it. Because some countries have good export controls, but the people involved in export control has never been involved in these discussions around money laundering. So, or financial regulation. So first start by mapping the resources that you have in the country. Who knows what? And you may be surprised. And then secondly, and I hinted at that on my last slide, I think turn to the FATF-style regional bodies, the FSRBs, like ISAMALAG, like the APG, like CFATF, and start discussions about regional assessments. Now, in some cases, the FSRB's footprint is too big. What you actually want to cluster together are countries that are economically linked to one another, because that would then make logical sense to perhaps start by doing a regional risk assessment. And what I'm advocating is a regional risk assessment with country chapters, because every country's risk will differ. In the Pacific, yes, for instance, all right, some countries have shipping registers, others don't. If you've got a shipping register, your risk profile looks a bit different. So country chapters can sort that out, but within a regional mechanism, and technical assistance is available from the large global bodies that provide technical assistance that could make that happen.
Thank you very much, Prof. Koker. I see we've got 1 minute left, so I just want to say thank you so much for taking your time to share your wealth of knowledge. As always, I learned something new, and I see from the chat that General is also saying that he's done something new, that this is a new concept for him. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Let me hand over to you for your final words as we say goodbye to our audience.
Thank you, Nolwazi. What a pleasure to join you. And please, if you're interested in this topic, stay in touch. You have my email. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Nolwazi, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone who attended this session. Hopefully you attend more, and goodbye.